Listen, there were boot prints circling his tent when he woke up. 2 complete loops around the nylon, pressed deep into the October mud, and they stopped 18 inches from the door, mid-stride, facing inward, in open ground with nowhere to go. No tree, no brush, nothing. The print size matched his boot exactly. His boots were just inside the door where he'd left them. Dry. His socks were dry. He'd sealed the zipper with a carabiner the night before because the pull tab had broken 3 days in. The carabiner was still clipped from the inside. He drove out at first light and has not tent camped since. That was 11 years ago. Here is how he got there. His name was Marcus, and he had gone to the Nantahala to get some quiet. That's the entire reason. Not adventure, not a bucket list trail, not anything he'd planned for more than 2 weeks. He'd separated from his wife in late September, moved into a friend's spare room in Waynesville, and decided after about 10 days of staring at a stranger's ceiling that he needed to be somewhere without walls he hadn't chosen. He'd camped in the Nantahala 6 or 7 times before. He knew the terrain well enough. He packed his truck on a Thursday, drove to the Waya Bald trailhead, signed his name in the trail register at 8:42 in the morning, checked his paper map, and started walking. He was not looking for anything strange. He was trying to get some quiet. He carried a 3-season tent, a week's worth of food, a water filter, a headlamp with fresh batteries, and a paperback he'd grabbed from the friend's shelf without reading the back cover. His phone had about 60% battery when he left the trailhead. He lost cell service before he crossed the first ridge, which was expected. He found a flat campsite near a seasonal creek 2 ridges in, set up his tent before dark, hung his food bag, and heated a can of soup on a small backpacking stove. He ate, sitting on a log, watching the fire settle, listening to the creek. The first 2 nights were easy. He slept well. He didn't dream much. He hiked short loops during the day, refilled his water from the creek, read the paperback with his headlamp, and went to sleep when it got cold. The dog helped. He'd borrowed his neighbor's blue tick, a 5-year-old male named Holt who was nervous in new terrain, but settled down quickly once he understood the routine. Holt slept inside the tent against Marcus's legs. Both mornings he'd woken up to fog in the creek bottom and the sound of birds in the hemlocks, and nothing unusual. Day 3 was different. It started at dusk, while Marcus was gathering firewood on the downslope side of camp. He was about 30 yards from the tent when the creek went quiet. Not gradually, completely. 1 second there was water moving over rock, insects in the laurel, the whole ordinary background of an October hollow. Then nothing. The silence had a physical quality to it, like pressure dropping before a storm. Marcus stood still and listened. Holt, who had been sniffing along the creek bank, simply sat down and faced the hemlocks below the camp. Not growling, not barking, just sitting, fully alert, looking at the tree line. It lasted about 90 seconds. Then the creek came back, the insects came back, and Holt stood up and shook himself and went back to sniffing along the bank like nothing had happened. Marcus told himself it was a bear. Black bears were common in the Nantahala, and a large one moving through the area would suppress the ambient sound exactly like that. Holt was a nervous dog in unfamiliar country. His behavior made sense. Marcus gathered the rest of the firewood and went back to camp. He made dinner. He read for a while. The fire burned down to coals and he let it go, too tired to feed it. He was inside the tent by 9, headlamp on. Holt stretched out beside him. The pull tab on the zipper had broken 2 days in, so he'd been using a small carabiner clipped through the slider as a makeshift handle. He zipped the tent from the inside, clipped the carabiner, and settled into his sleeping bag. He was almost asleep when he heard them. 3 footsteps on dead leaves on the uphill side of the tent. Slow. Spaced like a person walking carefully. Very close. Close enough that he could hear the leaves compress. Close enough to tell that whatever made them had weight. He held his breath. Holt sat up. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He just turned and faced the tent wall, the uphill wall, and sat there rigid, ears forward. Nothing else moved. Marcus lay still for what felt like 2 minutes. Then he unzipped the tent halfway, clipped the carabiner back, and shone his headlamp out into the dark. The beam swept across the hemlock stand below the camp. The fire ring, the food bag hanging from its branch, the dark slope above. Nothing, no shape, no eyes, no movement. He rezipped. He sat up in his sleeping bag and listened. Holt lay back down after about 5 minutes, slowly, the way dogs do when they've decided a threat has moved off. Marcus kept the headlamp in his hand. He told himself the most likely explanation out loud, very quietly, to hear how it sounded in the dark. A deer, moving downslope toward the creek, passing within 20 feet of the tent. Deer moved quietly at night. They moved differently from what you expected. The silence had been a bear moving through, and the footsteps were a deer following the same downslope line an hour later. Both things were true and ordinary and not connected. He believed about half of that. He lay back down, pulled the sleeping bag up, and turned off the headlamp. The fog had come up from the creek bottom while he'd been in the tent. He could hear it now. Or rather, he could hear the absence of distant sound that meant the fog had thickened, that the ridge sounds had been muffled, that the small world of his campsite had become smaller. Just the tent. The fire ring, the first few trees, the creek somewhere below. He was almost asleep when it happened. From the uphill side of the tent, right where the footsteps had been, came a sound so careful it almost wasn't a sound. A slow, metallic slide. A pause. Then again. The zipper. Something outside was testing the zipper of his tent. Marcus did not move. Holt did not move. The dog was awake. He could tell by the breathing, the way Holt's ribcage had gone shallow and deliberate. But Holt was not barking. He was sitting rigid against Marcus's legs, facing the tent wall, making no sound at all. The carabiner was clipped from the inside. He had done it himself 4 minutes ago. He had felt it click. The zipper test did not repeat. One slow pull, a pause, then another, and then silence. No more footsteps, no more sound from the hemlocks. Nothing moved against the tent fabric. The fog pressed against everything outside, and Marcus lay in his sleeping bag in the dark with his headlamp in his fist and his thumb on the switch, listening to Holt hold absolutely still against his legs. And he did not turn the light on. He did not turn it on because some part of him understood, in the wordless way that understanding sometimes arrives at night in the woods, that turning the light on would confirm what the sound had already suggested. Something was at the door of his tent, and whatever it was, already knew where the zipper was. He stayed in that tent for 4 hours without moving. Then the light came. Not dawn, not yet. Just the first gray suggestion of it. The kind of light that doesn't illuminate so much as it separates the dark into layers. Tree shapes, ground, sky. Marcus had been awake for every minute of those 4 hours. He knew because he'd checked his phone twice, each time shielding the screen against his chest so the light wouldn't bleed through the tent fabric. 1:14, then 3:07. He hadn't checked again after that. He'd just waited. The zipper sound did not repeat. Nothing pressed against the tent walls, nothing circled the nylon, nothing made another sound on the uphill slope. After the first hour, Holt had laid his head down across Marcus's ankles. and that helped more than Marcus wanted to admit. The dog's breathing told him more than his headlamp would have. When Holt slept, Marcus could almost believe the thing outside had been a branch. Almost. At first light, he unclipped the carabiner. He unzipped the tent in one slow pull, and he stepped outside. He saw the prints immediately. They started from the uphill slope, from the direction of the hemlock stand, and they came straight down to the tent, and then they circled it. Twice. 2 full loops around the nylon, each print pressed deep and clean into the soft October mud, evenly spaced, human stride length, moving with the unhurried consistency of something that had not been in a hurry. The loops were not approximate. They were deliberate, and they stopped, not turned, not faded, not angled away toward the trees. They stopped, mid-stride, 18 inches from the tent door, facing inward, in open ground with nothing behind them. No brush, no rock, no tree. Just the print, and then nothing. Marcus stood in the entrance of his tent for a long time looking at them. His own boots were just inside the door where he'd left them the night before. He checked them anyway, dry soles, dry laces. He checked his socks. Dry. He had not sleepwalked. He had not left the tent. He walked the print slowly, following the loop from where it descended the slope. The size matched his boot, close enough that it bothered him, but the tread pattern in the mud was smeared at the edges, distorted by the moisture in the soil, not clean enough to confirm or deny a specific sole. A person could make that argument. He made it to himself, standing there in the gray morning with his coffee still unstarted and Holt at his heel. Then he tried to find where the prints went after the loop ended. They didn't go anywhere. The mud around the tent was undisturbed in every direction except the 2-loop circuit. Whatever made the prints had arrived from the slope, circled the tent, stopped 18 inches from the door, and was simply not present in the physical record anymore. It had not stepped into the leaf litter. It had not returned upslope. The hemlock stand was 30 feet away, and the ground between the tent and the trees showed nothing. He tried to make Holt approach the hemlocks. The dog sat down. Not the sit of a dog being stubborn, the sit of a dog that had made a decision. Marcus took 3 photographs on his phone. The screen was cracked from a dropped phone incident 2 weeks earlier, and the camera lens had a hairline fracture across the lower left corner that put a faint blur on everything. The photos came out showing the prints but soft at the edges, the kind of images that prove something happened without proving what it was. He looked at them for a moment, then pocketed the phone and started breaking down his tent. He did not run. He moved deliberately, the way he would have moved if he believed a bear had been sniffing around camp in the night, and he didn't want to alarm it if it was still in the area. He rolled the sleeping bag, deflated the pad, collapsed the poles, stuffed the tent into its sack. He took down the food bag. He filled his water bottles because he knew the crossing would take time, and he didn't want to stop again until he was off the trail. Holt stayed within arm's reach the entire time. He crossed the creek and climbed the first ridge without stopping. He crossed the second ridge 40 minutes later. He was at the trailhead parking lot before noon, and he sat in the cab of his truck for a minute just feeling the heat of the vinyl seat and the ordinary sound of wind on the windows. And then he drove south on 4 Ford 1 toward Franklin. He stopped at a gas station outside of town, ordered a coffee from the machine by the register, the bad kind in a paper cup with a plastic lid. He sat in the truck in the parking lot and drank half of it before he remembered something. The attendant at that same gas station, that specific one, on 441, he was almost certain, had said something to him 4 days earlier when he'd stopped to fill his tank on the way in. Marcus had mentioned he was camping in the Nantahala alone for a week. The man had nodded, bagged his receipt, and said, almost as an afterthought, Keep your tent zipped. Marcus had laughed. He'd assumed it was about bears or raccoons, the kind of practical advice locals gave visitors who didn't know the area. He had not asked why. He thought about that now, sitting in the same parking lot with the same bad coffee, looking at the 3 soft photographs on a cracked phone screen. Keep your tent zipped. Not keep your food bag hung, not watch for bear sign, not make noise on the trail. Keep your tent zipped. He didn't go back inside and ask the attendant what he'd meant. He told himself later that he wasn't sure it was the same man, that he might be misremembering. Maybe that's true. He drove home instead. He returned his neighbor's dog. He never filed anything with the ranger station because, as he put it when he submitted this account, he didn't know what he would have said. The photographs are still on an old phone he keeps in a kitchen drawer. He has shown them to 2 people. Both of them said it was probably somebody messing with him. A prank. Somebody who'd seen his campsite and decided to have some fun. He doesn't argue with that, but he mentions the carabiner every time. The one he clipped himself from the inside before he went to sleep. The one that was still clipped when he woke up. Whoever had been out there testing the zipper, and something had been testing it, both he and Holt were awake for that, had been doing it from the outside, with no way to open the door. The prints faced inward. They stopped 18 inches from the door, and they faced inward, and the next step was never taken. He has not tent camped since. Not every Appalachian account involves a trail. Some of them involve a room. And a rule that was given freely, only once, and ignored anyway. This one came from a woman, we'll call her Rennie, who spent 2 nights in her grandmother's cabin in Ashe County after the old woman went into assisted living. She was there to clean it out. She knew about the back bedroom. She'd known about it since she was a child. The door had been nailed shut for as long as anyone could remember, and her grandmother had explained the reason exactly once, in the kitchen of that same cabin, over coffee, when Rennie was 19 years old. She said, if something knocks 3 times on that door, you do not answer it. You do not touch the handle. You leave the house with what you can carry, and you come back in daylight. Rennie had thought the old woman was telling a story. She drove up to the cabin on a Wednesday morning in March, 2 weeks after her grandmother had moved into the facility in Boone. The gravel road climbed 2 miles up a narrow hollow, hemmed in by bare hardwoods and old stands of rhododendron that scraped the sides of her car on the tight curves. The cabin sat at the road's end in a flat clearing, a low board and batten structure with a metal roof and a covered porch that ran the full length of the front. It looked smaller than she remembered from childhood. Most places do. Rennie was 38 years old, worked as an accountant in Charlotte, and had made the drive alone on a long weekend because her 2 cousins had offered to help and then hadn't. She was not superstitious. She was the kind of person who attributed strange sounds to structural causes, who found the rational explanation first and stayed there. She'd brought cleaning supplies, garbage bags, a box of packing tape, and a cooler with enough food for 3 days. She was going to sort through everything, donate what was usable, box what was family, and leave the rest for the estate sale company her mother had already scheduled. She was not thinking about the back bedroom when she pulled the nails. That was on the 2nd day. She'd spent the first day on the kitchen and the front room, which were full enough to keep her busy until dark. The cabin was cold. The wood stove worked, but took time to heat the space, and the walls clicked and settled all evening as the temperature outside dropped. She slept in the front bedroom, the one that had always been hers and her cousins when they visited as children, and she slept fine. The cabin made the sounds old cabins make. She knew how to sleep through that. On the 2nd morning, she started on the back of the cabin. The hallway ran straight from the front room to a small bathroom on the left and the back bedroom door on the right. The door was plain pine, painted over so many times the panels had lost their edges. 3 nails had been driven into the frame at an angle, not through the door, through the frame itself, pinning it shut from the outside. Old nails, painted over like everything else, but solid. Rennie stood in front of them for a moment. She thought about foundation vents, about whether the room had one that needed inspection, about fire safety, and the fact that a nailed door was a hazard. She thought about the estate company coming in 2 weeks and what they would make of a room they couldn't enter. She got a hammer from the toolbox her grandmother kept under the kitchen sink and she pulled the nails. They came out with a dry, splintering sound, and the door swung inward on its own from the pressure that had built behind it. The room was small. A single iron cot against the far wall, an old dresser, a cardboard box or 2 stacked in the corner, and a foundation vent on the exterior wall, the metal kind with a sliding lever to open and close it. The vent was closed. The room smelled like cold and cedar and the particular stillness of a space that hasn't moved air in a long time. Nothing about it was frightening. It looked like what it was, a room someone had stopped using. She propped the door open and went back to work. The first knock came that evening. She was in the kitchen making dinner, soup from a can, the stove's blue flame too small for the size of the pot, when she heard it. A single knock from the direction of the back bedroom. Not a bang, a knock. Deliberate, knuckle on wood, the sound a person makes when they want to be let in. She turned off the burner and stood still. The cabin was quiet. The wood stove ticked. Outside, the hollow wind moved through the bare trees. She went down the hallway and looked into the back bedroom. The window was intact. The vent was still closed. The room was exactly as she'd left it. She stood in the doorway for a moment listening, and then she looked at the back bedroom's window frame. Old wood, slightly warped, and she could see a hairline gap at the top sash where the wind would find it. Wind pressure against an imperfect frame. That was the sound. She'd heard it before in old houses. She went back and finished her soup. The second knock came after midnight. She was in bed, nearly asleep when it arrived. 2 knocks this time, from the back bedroom door, from the inside. Sharp and clear and spaced like speech, like the rhythm of someone who expected an answer. She lay still. Her heart was going faster than she would have admitted. The window explanation didn't work for this. The sound had come from the door, not the wall, not the frame. From the inside surface of a door that opened into an empty room. She did not get up. She pulled the blanket up and she stared at the ceiling and she counted her breaths and she waited. Nothing followed. The cabin settled. The wind moved in the hollow. After an hour, she was still awake, but nothing else came, and somewhere after that, she slept. She almost left in the morning. She told herself afterward that she should have left in the morning. She had enough packed to go. But she looked at the back bedroom in daylight, and it was just a room, and she had one more day of work that the estate company would charge her for if she didn't finish. And in the flat gray light of a March morning, the previous night felt like something her tired brain had sharpened into more than it was. She kept the back bedroom door open all day. She worked quickly. She kept the radio on. The third knock came at 2 in the morning. 3 knocks, slow, from the interior of the back bedroom door. Spaced like the first 2, but slower. Patient. The way you knock when you've been waiting long enough. Rennie was already awake when it happened. She'd been lying in the dark for an hour, telling herself to go to sleep, listening to the sounds the cabin made and sorting them one by one into causes she understood. The wood stove, the wind, the pipes. She had been through the whole list twice when the knocks came, and she knew immediately, the way you sometimes know things before your mind has caught up, that this was the third time. and that her grandmother had been specific about the third time. She got up, she carried her keys. She pulled on her coat over her pajamas and she went into the hallway. The back bedroom door was at the end of it, and the hallway light was dim, and she walked to the door without thinking about it the way you walk towards something before fear has finished arriving. Her hand closed around the handle. She stood there. She has tried to explain what happened next, and she can't do it precisely. She didn't hear another sound. Nothing pushed against the door from the other side. She simply stood there with her hand on the handle and found that she could not make herself turn it. Not from paralysis, not from a locked joint. From something quieter than that. Her grandmother's voice in her memory, very even, the way the old woman said things she meant permanently. You do not touch the handle. She had already touched the handle. She let go of it. She picked up her cooler, her keys, her phone, and her purse, and she walked out of the front door and got in her car and drove to the bottom of the hollow and slept reclined in the driver's seat until daylight came over the ridge. She went back in the morning. The cabin was silent. She went to the back bedroom first. The cot had moved, not overturned, not thrown across the room. Moved 6, maybe 8 inches from where it had been against the wall, angled slightly toward the door. She stood in the doorway looking at it for a long time, measuring the distance from the wall with her eyes, trying to remember whether she'd nudged it herself during the day's work. She hadn't. She'd barely entered the room. She checked the foundation vent. Closed. Latched from the inside, the small lever seated firmly in its notch. She called her grandmother that afternoon from the bottom of the hollow where she had 2 bars of service. She told her what had happened, all of it, the knocks, the handle, sleeping in the car. Her grandmother listened to the whole thing and then said, "You came back in daylight, that's right. Then, did you answer it?" Rennie said no. Her grandmother said, "Good," and asked about the drive down. That was the entire conversation. Rennie hired someone else to finish clearing the cabin. She did not spend another night there. When the property sold the following spring, she asked the realtor not to list the back bedroom separately in the description. She doesn't know if the new owners were told about the door. She has thought about that occasionally in the years since, and she has not called to ask. The cot was facing the door. Whatever had knocked and gone unanswered had still been in that room when she left. She knows that. Whatever had been patient enough to knock 3 times, slow and spaced, from the interior of a nailed-shut room. It had moved the cot toward the door while she slept in her car in the hollow below, and it had done it quietly enough that she heard nothing. She heard nothing. Some accounts come from families who kept the story quiet for years. Others come from people who were paid to go in and couldn't file what they actually found. This one came through a hiking forum in western North Carolina, posted by an anonymous user who identified themselves only as a retired Forest Service employee from Cherokee County. They included a note that said the account was based on handwritten notes and one conversation they'd agreed to have about it, and that their name was not to be used under any circumstances. A second user who knew them confirmed the broad details. The forum post has since been removed, but the account was copied and shared enough times that it survived. His name, for the purposes of this account, is Darnell. He worked the Fires Creek area of the Nantahala National Forest for 19 years. He was not a man who startled easily. He described himself as someone who'd found 3 bodies in the woods over the course of his career and filed the paperwork each time without losing sleep. He said that before this assignment, he had believed that everything in the forest had an explanation, and that the explanation was usually simpler and sadder than the rumor. He said this particular thing, the thing that happened at the fire tower, changed that belief in a specific and bounded way. Not broadly, specifically, about one ridge, about 3 nights, about a log entry that should not have existed. The assignment came down in early October, after a late-season storm moved through the Fires Creek drainage and knocked out 2 radio relay points on the ridge above. Somebody needed to go up to the fire tower, run manual radio checks for 3 nights, document any trail damage visible from the cab, and make sure the equipment hadn't been damaged by the wind. It was routine work. Darnell had done solo tower stays before, 4 or 5 times over the years, and he'd never had a problem beyond a bad propane connection, and one memorable night when a bear had investigated the supply box at the tower base for 40 minutes while he sat upstairs and waited it out. He drove the service road to the tower base on a Monday afternoon, unlocked the gate, and stopped. The gate was already unlocked. The chain was looped through the latch in the normal way, but the padlock was open, hanging from one link. He stood there for a moment looking at it. The maintenance crew had been up the week before to check the relay equipment, or had tried to. The storm had cut that visit short, and it was possible one of them had left the lock undone. Sloppy, but possible. He noted it, locked it behind him with his own key, and drove up. The tower was a standard fire lookout, 60 feet of steel lattice with a small enclosed cab at the top. The access stairs ran up the outside in 2 flights with a landing in between. There was a north staircase and a south staircase, both metal grate, both exposed to the weather. The cab had a cot, a fold-down table, a propane stove, a radio unit, storm shutters on all 4 sides, and a logbook that sat on the table beside the radio. The logbook was how Darnell knew immediately that something was wrong. He set his gear down and opened it to where the entries should resume, right after the last ranger visit, dated 2 weeks prior. 2 pages after that entry, in his own handwriting, were 2 additional entries. He read them twice before he moved. The first was dated 3 days into the future, the date of his 3rd night at the tower. It read, in his hand, in blue ink, "Wind from the north. Do not use the north stairs after dark." The second entry was dated the morning after that. Most of it was smeared, as though the page had gotten wet before the ink dried, but the legible portion read, "I should not have looked at the," and stopped there, mid-sentence, the pen trailing off into a short drag mark across the paper. Darnell set the logbook down on the table. He picked it back up. He read both entries 4 more times. The handwriting was his, not similar to his, not the same general character, but specifically his. The particular way he formed the number 3, the way his capital D leaned slightly forward. He had not written these entries. He was certain of that, the way you are certain of things that don't require argument. He considered calling the station and rejected it before he'd finished the thought. There was no way to explain what he was looking at without sounding like a man who needed to be relieved. He took a photograph of both entries with his phone, pocketed the logbook page's image, and set the book aside. He told himself there was a rational answer. Someone who knew his handwriting well enough to imitate it had been in the tower. The maintenance crew, maybe. A prank with poor timing. He would figure out which crew member had done it, and have a very specific conversation with them when he got back. He ran his radio checks and made dinner and told himself that. The first night passed quietly until 40 minutes past midnight. He was on the cot, not quite asleep, when he heard the footsteps on the north stairs. Metal grate stairs have a distinctive sound, a hollow, resonant clang when weight comes down on them, different from any other surface. These were not the random thermal pops of a cooling structure. They came one at a time, evenly spaced, ascending, slow enough to count. He counted 7 steps before he was on his feet. He crossed to the north door and opened it in one motion, flashlight already on. The stairs were empty. His light reached the full length of both flights, top to bottom, the landing between them, the ground below. Empty. The stairs were wet from the earlier fog, each metal tread holding a thin film of moisture, and there were no footprints on any of them. Not a smear, not a disturbance. He stood in the open doorway for 2 minutes, sweeping the flashlight across the stairs, the platform, the tree line below. Nothing. The forest was quiet in the way forests are quiet after something has moved through, not peaceful, just finished. He went back inside and sat on the edge of the cot. Metal towers expand and contract with temperature changes. He knew this. The sound could have been thermal movement in the staircase frame, each joint releasing in sequence as the night cooled, producing something that mimicked footsteps. The rhythm had been wrong for that, too irregular, too weighted, too much like a person being careful. But he could construct the argument, and he constructed it, and he lay back down. He didn't sleep much after that. Day 2 was ordinary in the way days can be ordinary when you are keeping yourself focused on procedure. He ran his morning radio check, documented the trail damage he could see from the cab, 2 blowdowns on the south slope, 1 section of trail obscured by debris, ate breakfast, and spent the middle of the day doing a methodical inspection of the tower base and the surrounding area. He found nothing that shouldn't have been there. The gate at the service road was locked as he'd left it. The supply box at the base was undisturbed. He walked the perimeter in an expanding circle, the way he'd been trained to search, and he found nothing. In the afternoon, he came back upstairs and looked at the smeared entry again. He held his flashlight at a low angle against the page, the way you do to read impression marks, and the smeared word came slightly clearer in the raking light. It was either ground or possibly clearing. He couldn't be certain, but the sentence appeared to read, "I should not have looked at the ground," or "I should not have looked at the clearing before it stopped." He noted this and didn't know what to do with it. That night he moved the cot away from the north wall. He kept the radio on low, a quiet, static presence that made the cab feel less like a box suspended 60 feet above the trees. He was almost genuinely asleep at 2 in the morning when the stairs started again. South stairs, this time. The same rhythm, 1 step, pause, 1 step, ascending. He lay completely still and he counted. He got to 11 before the sound stopped, 1 step below the level of the south door. He did not open the south door. He lay there with his eyes open and his hand on the flashlight, and he waited. Whatever was on the stairs, if anything was on the stairs, did not knock, did not try the door. After 10 minutes, the sound did not resume, and the forest outside was quiet, and Darnell stayed exactly where he was until the sky began to gray through the east-facing window. The forecast weather system was early. By afternoon of day 3, the wind had shifted hard out of the north, exactly as the entry had described. And by early evening, a steady rain was coming in from the northwest, sheeting against the storm shutters, filling the air with the low, constant roar that rain makes on a metal roof when it means it. The cab was warm enough from the propane stove. The radio was running steady static, the storm degrading the signal until the station was barely audible. He looked at the entry one more time. Wind from the north. Do not use the north stairs after dark. He had used the north stairs on night 1 in the dark to investigate the footsteps. He had opened the north door and shone his light down the empty steps and stood in the open doorway for 2 minutes. He thought about the timing. The entry was dated tonight. He had done the thing the entry warned against 2 nights ago. He was still working through that when the radio spoke. Not the station. The station was static. Something underneath the static, or alongside it, on the same frequency, occupying the same channel without overriding it, said his name. Not his call sign, not his title, his name. First and last, clearly, the way someone says a name when they want to make sure they have the right person. He keyed the radio immediately. "Station, this is Tower. Confirm last transmission." The station, through the static. "Tower, station here. We did not transmit. Say again." He said, "Someone used this frequency. My name was used. Can you confirm the channel is clear?" The station said the channel was assigned and closed, that no other units were operating on it, that the frequency should be clear. They asked if he needed anything. He said no and signed off. The rain came harder against the north shutters. The propane stove ticked. Darnell sat on the edge of the cot with the radio in his lap and listened to the storm work its way across the ridge, and somewhere below the tower, in the dark and the rain, something had known his name and known the frequency and known how to find him on it. He did not sleep at all on night 3. The rain was still on the roof when he made it to morning. He'd sat upright on the cot through the whole of it, the radio in his lap, the propane stove running low, listening to the storm move across the ridge and then, slowly, over the course of several hours, begin to pull back. By 4 in the morning, the rain had thinned to a drip from the eaves. By 5, the wind had dropped. By the time gray light came through the east shutter, the forest below the tower was the particular kind of still that follows a hard night. Everything wet and flattened and quiet, and Darnell had not slept a minute of it. He ran his morning radio check at 6. The station came in clearly now that the storm had passed. He gave his status as normal. He did not mention the voice on the frequency. He had spent the night hours thinking through the rational account of that voice, and he had gotten it to a place he could almost stand in. Radio frequencies bleed. A strong enough transmission from the right terrain angle could override a closed channel, produce an artifact that sounded like speech, and the storm had created exactly the kind of atmospheric conditions that made radio behavior unpredictable. His name was 2 common syllables. Pattern recognition under stress could assemble those syllables from static. He'd been awake for most of 2 nights. His mind was working against him. That was the argument. He made it carefully, and he kept making it while he packed his gear, folded the cot blanket, shut down the propane stove, and prepared to descend. He took the south stairs. He didn't decide to take the south stairs. He simply found himself at the south door rather than the north one, and he went through it, and he descended. At the tower base, he walked the perimeter the way he had on day 2, expanding circle, methodical. On the north side, he found nothing at the base of the stairs. On the south side, at the base of the south leg, the grass was pressed flat in a wide, even circle. Not trampled, not the random compression of an animal moving through. Pressed flat with the specific evenness of something that had stood in one place for a sustained period of time. The circle was roughly 3 feet across. The grass at its edges was still slightly raised where the pressure ended, giving the flattened area a clean perimeter. No boot prints, no paw prints, no claw marks in the soft soil at the circle's edge. Whatever had stood there had stood without leaving the impression of a foot, and had stood long enough to press the grass flat to the ground. Darnell photographed it. He photographed the base of the south staircase, the pressed circle, the surrounding soil. Then he stood and looked at the south tree line for a long time. The smeared entry. I should not have looked at the clearing was what he'd decided the smeared word said. The clearing at the south base of the tower, where the grass was pressed and the ground showed nothing that should have been capable of pressing it. He had looked. Last night, through the south window with his flashlight, he had looked directly at the base of the tower where the shape had been standing. He had seen it, pale, nearly upright, the wrong geometry for anything he could name. And he had turned the flashlight off. and when he'd turned it back on 90 seconds later, the shape was gone. He hadn't written that part down yet. He'd been considering whether to write it down at all. He took the logbook with him when he left. Not as a violation of protocol, he told himself it was evidence of the prank, which was still his working theory for the handwritten entries. But he took it. He filled out his checkout documentation on a separate form and submitted that to the station. He described the tower base condition as normal. He listed the trail damage he'd observed. He noted the radio anomaly as possible storm interference and recommended a frequency check on the equipment. He did not attach the photographs of the pressed circle. The photographs are in a folder on his phone. The logbook page, the one with the future entries, is folded and kept in the glove box of his truck. He has not filed it anywhere. The equipment team ran a diagnostic on the radio unit 2 weeks after the assignment. They found the unit in full working order. No malfunction. No irregularity that could produce an artifact on a closed frequency. The report noted that the unit was performing within normal parameters and recommended no further action. Darnell requested reassignment to ground patrol only when he returned. He told his supervisor it was a preference issue, that he'd decided solo tower stays didn't suit him the way they used to. His supervisor accepted this without much discussion. Rangers change preferences. It happens. He retired 14 months later. He listed his reason as years of service, which was accurate. He had 31 years in the Forest Service by then and was fully eligible. Whether the tower was the reason or just the accumulation of it, he couldn't say precisely. He said once, in the conversation that produced this account, that working in the forest for that many years meant carrying a lot of things you'd seen and heard and not been able to explain away, and that most of them you learned to set aside, and that this one he hadn't been able to set aside. He'd been trying to set it aside for 14 months, and it hadn't moved. The thing that stayed with him was not the shape, not the pressed grass, not the voice on the frequency, not even the footsteps on the stairs. The thing that stayed with him was the pen. The supply kit at the tower, the box of standard materials left there for any ranger doing a stay, contained, among other things, a blue medium point pen. Standard issue. When those pens left the supply warehouse, they came sealed. A small band of factory plastic around the cap and barrel. When Darnell arrived at the tower and opened the logbook, the pen in the supply kit had a broken seal. The plastic band had been removed. The pen had been used. The supply kit had been at the tower for 2 weeks before Darnell's arrival. He was the first person assigned to the tower after the kit had been restocked. The future dated entries, the entries in his handwriting, warning him about the north stairs, stopping mid-sentence on the morning after, had been written with a pen that was already at the tower. Written before he arrived. Written in his hand. Dated to his stay. He has no explanation for that. He has tried to construct one and he cannot make it hold. The log page is in his glove box. He's moved twice since retiring. The page has been in every truck. Not all of these accounts involve staying somewhere. Some of them happen between destinations, on a road, in the space of a mile and a half. This one was submitted with the location detail left intact. State Road 9, Madison County, North Carolina, the section that climbs the ridge east of Marshall. The submitter kept her name out of it but was specific about everything else. She wanted the location named. She said she'd thought about why she wanted that, and she decided it was because she didn't want anyone else to be surprised by it the way she was surprised. She was driving home from a friend's house in Marshall on a clear September night, sometime around 10:40. The interstate had backed up from an accident near the highway interchange, and she'd taken SR 9 over the ridge instead because she knew the road and it would save her 20 minutes. She had a full tank. Her phone had service until the ridge, and then didn't, which was normal for that section. She wasn't worried about it. She had driven SR9 in daylight a handful of times, and at night exactly once before, the previous fall, without incident. She knew the deer were active on the eastern face after dark, so she was already slowing for the curves. Music on, windows up. She was thinking about a conversation she'd had at her friend's house. Something unresolved and slightly uncomfortable the way those conversations can be, when her headlights found the first curve. There was a man on the road's edge, barefoot, gray shirt, walking uphill at a steady pace, arms at his sides, moving with the unhurried consistency of someone who knew exactly where he was going. She slowed and gave him room and passed him carefully, and in her rear view she watched him continue walking without reacting to the car at all. He didn't look up. He didn't flinch from the headlights. He just kept walking. She thought, drunk or lost, or a local who walked this road regularly and had his reasons. Barefoot was strange, but it was warm for September, and some people were like that. She turned her attention back to the road and kept driving. A mile further, at the second curve, he was there. Same gray shirt, same bare feet, same uphill walking pace, arms at his sides. She slowed again, passed him again, checked the rear view again. Same lack of reaction. He did not look at the car. She turned off the radio without deciding to. She told herself it was a different man. Brothers, maybe. Two people from the same household who both walked this road at night. She was aware of how that sounded even as she constructed it. There was no turnoff between the first curve and the second. She'd been driving at 20 miles an hour on that section, and a person walking uphill at a normal pace could not have covered more than 50 yards in the time it had taken her to drive a mile. The math didn't work, and she knew the math didn't work, and she kept driving because the alternative was to stop on a one-lane mountain road in the dark with no cell service and no shoulder, and that was not a choice she was willing to make. The third curve was 2 miles further. He was ahead of her. Same man, same shirt, same bare feet. Ahead of her car, at the apex of the curve, which meant he had not passed her. There was nowhere to pass, no room, she would have felt it, and had not been deposited there by any vehicle, because there had been no vehicle. She had been watching her mirrors. He was simply there, ahead of her, at the third curve, 2 miles past the second, walking uphill at a steady pace, as though the distance between the curves was nothing, as though the road worked differently for him than it did for her headlights. She slowed to nearly a stop. He turned his head. He looked directly at her headlights, and she could not see his face. She had her headlights on, full beam, and the light was on him, and she still could not see his face properly. Not darkness, not shadow, just the light not working on him the way it should have worked, the illumination arriving and doing nothing useful. She sat there for 2 or 3 seconds that felt much longer, and then she accelerated through the curve and drove. She did not look in the rear view until she reached the long straightaway at the ridge's eastern descent. The figure was in the middle of the road behind her, standing still, facing the direction she was driving. Not following, not moving, just standing in the center of the road where her taillights reached him, watching her go, visible until the curve took him from her sight. She drove to the first gas station she found 12 miles down the mountain, and parked under the lights and sat in her car for 20 minutes with the doors locked. Then she called her friend in Marshall, the one she'd just left, because she needed to say it out loud to someone who knew the road. Her friend listened to the whole account without interrupting. When it was finished, there was a pause, and then her friend said, "Was he wearing gray?" She said yes. Her friend said, "Don't call the sheriff, they'll tell you it was a drunk." She asked her friend what she knew about the road. Her friend said she'd grown up in Marshall, and there had been other accounts from that ridge, other people who'd seen something on SR 9 at night. She didn't elaborate beyond that, except for one thing. She said, "There's a rule about that road. You don't flash your headlights at anything you see on it." She hadn't flashed her headlights. She told her friend that. Her friend said, "Good," and didn't say anything else about it. The rule had arrived after the fact. Whether it had ever applied to her situation, whether following it had protected her, or whether her particular encounter operated outside whatever the rule was designed for, she doesn't know. She was never given the rest of the rule. Just the one instruction, delivered too late to be useful, by someone who said it like it mattered. She has not driven SR 9 at night since. She takes the interstate regardless of the traffic. The figure in her rear view stood in the center of the road and watched her taillights until the curve removed it from view. It did not follow her. It did not need to. It was already at every curve that it mattered, and whatever it was doing on that road, she had driven through the middle of it, and she had come out the other side, and she still isn't entirely sure why. Roads can be passed through. But some places in Appalachia, once you go down into them, don't let you think about leaving the same way you arrived. This account has been known in Hayesville for a long time. Different versions of it exist, the way local stories accumulate detail and shed it depending on who's telling them. But the version here comes from the son, a man named Ray, who was 31 years old when it happened, and is considerably older now. He doesn't talk about it much. When he does, he starts with the same thing every time. His father Gerald gave him the rule that morning, in the truck, on the way up the forest road, and Ray had never heard it before in 31 years of hunting with the man. That was the part that bothered him most. Not what happened in the hollow. The fact that his father had known something all along, and had never said it until the morning it became relevant. Gerald was 58 that fall, and had been hunting the hollow below Cutter's Creek since he was a teenager, the way his own father had before him. He knew that terrain the way you know a place you've moved through in every season for 40 years. The deer trails, the soft ground near the creek bottom, the laurel thickets that held scent, the ridgeline above where the wind came from. He had a system. He and Ray would split at the creek and work the opposite slopes toward each other, which meant crossing the creek twice and covering both the east and west faces of the hollow by midday. They'd done it this way for years. The truck cab smelled like gun oil and the bad coffee Gerald made at 4 in the morning, strong enough to strip varnish, poured into a dented thermos he'd owned since Ray was in grade school. The forest road was uneven and clay-rutted from the recent rain, and Gerald drove it slowly, both hands on the wheel, not talking the way he didn't talk in the mornings. Ray watched the headlights pick out the tree line and drank his coffee and waited for the sky to lighten. They were a quarter mile from the gate when Gerald said it. "Don't cross the creek if the birds stop." Ray looked at him. Gerald was still watching the road. Ray said, "When do birds ever stop in a hollow?" Gerald said, "You'll know. It won't be gradual." He paused. "They'll stop all at once." Ray waited for more. Gerald didn't offer more. He parked at the gate, got out, unlocked it, and started checking his rifle in the headlights with the focused efficiency of a man who considered the conversation finished. Ray stood by the tailgate and looked at the back of his father's head, and understood that asking further questions would produce nothing useful. Gerald gave rules without stories. He always had. You learned the reason later, or you didn't, and either way the rule stood. The dog was already off the tailgate and working the brush at the gate's edge, nose down, tail going. Trace was a 5-year-old blue tick they'd had since he was 8 weeks old. A good hunting dog who was steady on deer and reliable in thick cover. He moved with the focused energy of an animal that understood exactly what the morning was for, and watching him helped Ray set aside the question of why his father had a creek rule he'd never mentioned before. The hollow opened below them as they descended, a long, steep-walled drainage with the creek running along its lowest point. The walls close enough that the sky above was a narrow stripe of lightning gray. The hardwoods were at full October color, the leaves not yet down, and in the early morning the hollow had the specific beauty of deep terrain in autumn. Everything saturated and still. The fog settled in the bottom near the water. Ray had hunted worse places. He had hunted few places that felt more enclosed. They split at the first good crossing point, Gerald taking the east face, Ray taking the west. Trace stayed with Ray, which was the usual arrangement. They would work down hollow toward the natural crossing near the bottom and meet there by midday. The morning went normally until Trace went into the laurel. It was a dense thicket on the lower west slope, the kind of mountain laurel that grows in tight interlocking tunnels close to the ground, the sort of cover that held scent for hours. Trace went in at a run, all-purpose hunting. Ray waited at the edge and listened for the sounds that meant Trace was working. The snap of branches, the low, excited whine of a dog on a good trail. He heard the branches briefly and then he heard the whine. Not excited. Continuous and low, the sound a dog makes when something has frightened it past the point of barking. Ray called him. Nothing. He called again. Gerald, from somewhere on the east face, called across the hollow. Nothing from Trace. Ray went in after him on hands and knees, pushing through the laurel stems, the ground damp under his palms, until he found Trace at the deepest point of the thicket. The dog was crouched against the back of the cover, pressed as far into the laurel as the stems would allow, and he was facing the wrong direction. He had gone into the thicket front first, following a scent line. He was now facing the way he'd come, which meant he had turned himself around in a space barely wide enough to turn in, and he had done it without Ray hearing him move. Trace had urinated. Gerald said snake when Ray reported it at the next crossing. Warm enough for copperheads to be moving, and Trace had met them before, and they rattled him every time. Ray accepted this. Trace came out of the thicket with his tail low and stayed closer to Ray than he normally would for the next hour, which was unusual behavior for a dog that confident in the field, but snake encounters did that. It passed. The morning continued. Around 1 in the afternoon, on the lower slope near the creek bottom, something moved on the far bank. It was big, both of them heard it, and it moved laterally through the brush, low to the ground, not the vertical bounce of a deer pushing through cover. The brush on the far bank was dense enough that neither of them got a clear look. Gerald watched the far bank for a long moment, his rifle at his side, and then he said, "Bear," and worked his way uphill without crossing. Ray noticed, after that Gerald was checking the creek more often than the terrain. Not, obviously, not the way you check something you're worried about, but with the casual frequency of a man keeping track of something. He also noticed that Gerald had not actually seen the animal. He'd heard it and called it. In 40 years in that hollow, he had earned the right to call what he hadn't seen, and Ray didn't question it, but he noticed. The fog came back to the creek bottom in the early afternoon, even though the morning had been clear. The hollow walls put the lower slope in shadow by 2 o'clock, and the combination of the fog and the shadow made the far bank intermittently unclear, visible and then not, the brush on the other side appearing and disappearing as the fog moved. Trace was walking within arm's reach of Ray's leg. He had not ranged out since the laurel thicket. They worked down hollow. The natural crossing was a flat shelf of exposed rock in the creek bed, 18 inches above the water line, wide enough to cross without getting your boots wet in normal conditions. Gerald had used it every fall for decades. They reached it in the middle of the afternoon and Gerald stopped. Ray stopped behind him. Trace stopped. The hollow went silent. Not gradually. Not the way sound fades when the wind drops or the birds move to a different part of the ridge. All at once, between 1 second and the next, everything stopped. The birds, the insects, the small constant movement of living things in a living forest, gone. The creek sounded louder in the silence because it was the only thing left. The water moving over the crossing rock with a clarity that felt wrong in the surrounding quiet. Gerald said, very quietly, "We're done." He turned uphill without looking at the far bank and started walking. Ray did not move immediately. He was looking at the far bank, at the fog and the brush, and there was something there. A shape in the gray, at the waterline, approximately where a large animal would stand if it had come down to drink and stopped. It was not moving. It had the stillness of something that has decided to hold position, which is a specific kind of stillness, different from the stillness of a log or a rock. It had depth to it, presence. Gerald was 10 yards uphill and not looking back. Ray stood at the crossing and looked at the shape on the far bank, and thought about deer and fog, and thought about bears, and thought about his father's rule, delivered that morning in the truck before light, delivered for the first time in 31 years of hunting together. He took 1 step onto the crossing rock. The creek divided around it the wrong way. The water upstream of the rock was nearly still, not calm, not slack, but held, as though something beneath the surface was interrupting the flow. Downstream, the water ran normally. He could see it. The creek was doing something at the crossing rock that creek water didn't do, and he stood on the rock with his boot in the thin film of water at its edge and looked at the shape on the far bank and felt the wrongness of the water under his foot. The shape had not moved. Gerald said his name. Just his name, the full version, the one his father used when he meant it. Ray stood on the rock. The shape on the far bank took 1 step backward and was gone. Not a deer stepping into cover. Not a bear turning from the bank. 1 step, lateral, upright, deliberate, and the fog closed behind it, and the brush on the far bank was still, and there was nothing there. The whole motion had taken less than a second. Ray stood on the crossing rock and watched the space where the shape had been, and the space showed him nothing, and the creek continued to divide wrong around the rock under his boot. Gerald had seen it. Ray knew this because when he turned around, his father was standing 8 yards uphill with his rifle at his side and his eyes on the far bank. And Gerald's face had the particular stillness of a man who has just confirmed something he was hoping not to confirm. He did not say what he'd seen. He put his hand on Ray's shoulder when Ray reached him, turned him uphill, and they walked. They did not speak on the way out. Gerald set a pace that wasn't quite a run, but was faster than their usual, and Ray matched it without question. He kept looking behind him, not because he heard anything following, but because the hollow below them was still completely silent. Every bird and insect and small movement of living things still absent, and that silence followed them up the slope like a pressure. The laurel thickets they pushed through on the way out felt closer than they had on the way in. The walls of the hollow felt steeper. The sky above the drainage was a narrower strip than Ray remembered from the morning. Trace was ahead of them both the entire way out. He did not range, did not investigate, did not pause to work a scent. He moved in a straight line toward the gate with the focused efficiency of an animal that knew exactly where a way was and intended to get there. The birds came back when they crossed the gate onto the forest road, not gradually, all at once, the same way they'd stopped, the hollow behind them suddenly full of the ordinary sounds of an October afternoon, as though someone had opened a door. Ray stopped walking when it happened. Gerald did not stop. He kept moving to the truck, leaned his rifle against the tailgate, and opened the cab door and sat in the driver's seat. Ray stood by the gate for a moment, listening to the birds, and then went to the truck. They drove for 10 minutes before Ray tried. He said, "What was on the far bank?" Gerald looked at the road. "I don't know." Ray waited. Then, "What did your father tell you about that hollow, when he gave you the rule?" Gerald said, "He told me the rule. I'm telling you. That's how it works." That was the whole conversation. Ray understood from the way Gerald said it that there was no story attached to the rule, or if there was, Gerald wasn't carrying it. His father had given him a boundary and an instruction and nothing else, the way you give someone what they need without giving them what would only frighten them. Gerald had done the same thing that morning on the drive up. The rule was the thing. The rule was what survived. They stopped at a diner in Hayesville because Gerald wanted coffee, and because Ray didn't want to be in the truck with the silence anymore. The diner was warm and smelled like fried food and old coffee, and the particular comfort of a place that has been the same for 30 years. They took a booth by the window. A woman named Darla brought them menus and coffee without being asked, the way good diner waitresses do, and she looked at Gerald once when she set his cup down, and then looked away, and did not ask them how their hunt had gone. Ray noticed this. He noticed that she had read something in Gerald's face, and had decided not to engage with it, which was a thing that people in small towns sometimes did when they recognized a particular kind of tired. They ordered food. They ate most of it. Ray drank 2 cups of coffee, and Gerald drank 3, and neither of them talked about the hollow. Ray looked out the window at the parking lot and the road beyond it and the ridge in the distance, and thought about the creek dividing wrong around the crossing rock. The water upstream gone nearly still in a way that shouldn't have been possible, as though something beneath the surface or behind the surface was holding it. Trace didn't leave the truck the entire time they were in the diner. Ray had cracked the window for him before they went in and checked on him after 20 minutes. The dog was in the back seat, upright, watching the diner window. Not the parking lot. The window. When Ray opened the truck door to check on him, Trace did not get down. He pressed against the far side of the back seat and watched Ray with an expression Ray had never seen on a hunting dog before. Not fear, exactly, but the particular alertness of an animal that has decided that staying inside the vehicle was the only acceptable option, and intended to maintain that decision regardless of what was asked of him. Ray closed the door and went back inside. Gerald paid the check without discussion. They drove back to Ray's house and unloaded the gear in the driveway, and Gerald backed out without coming in, which was unusual. At the end of the driveway, he stopped and rolled the window down. He said, "That's the last time I'm hunting that hollow." Then he drove away. Ray has not returned to the hollow below Cutter's Creek. Gerald has not returned. Trace has not been in the woods below that gate since, and he died 3 years later of old age, and in those 3 years he would not approach the forest road that led to the hollow, even when they drove it for other reasons. He would sit in the back seat and watch the tree line, and that was all. Ray mentioned this account to 2 other hunters in Clay County in the years following. The first one nodded slowly and said he'd heard similar things about that drainage and didn't go down to the creek bottom in that section of the hollow anymore. The second one said nothing for a moment and then said, "Don't go down to the creek bottom if it gets quiet." That was all he said. He changed the subject and didn't come back to it. The rule exists in Hayesville the way certain local knowledge exists, not widely discussed, not explained, passed from person to person in the form of a single sentence delivered at the right moment. Don't cross the creek if the birds stop. Don't go down to the creek bottom if it gets quiet. Two versions of the same instruction. Both of them learned the way Gerald had apparently learned his, which was from someone who knew better than to give more than the rule. What stepped back into the fog on the far bank of Cutter's Creek that afternoon, upright, deliberate, one step and gone, has no confirmed identity. Ray describes it as a shape with presence, which is not a description that fits any category he knows how to use. The creek dividing wrong around the crossing rock is the detail he comes back to most often when he tells this account, because it is the detail that is hardest to dismiss. He can construct explanations for a shape in fog. He cannot construct an explanation for water that stops flowing correctly upstream of a rock it has been flowing over for decades. He stood on that rock for a few seconds with his boot in the thin water and felt the wrongness of it under him. And then his father said his name, and he stepped back. He is grateful, in a specific and quiet way, that he stepped back. Some places you choose to enter. Others, you pay for a room, unpack your bag, and realize too late that the town already knows something about you. This account came in through an anonymous submission with a note attached that read, "I know how this sounds. I'm a medical professional. I notice inconsistencies. What I'm describing is what I observed. The submitter is a traveling nurse. We'll call her Selah. She booked a room at a small motel in a town on the Clay and Cherokee County line, a place called Alderman's Gap, because it was close to the hospital where she'd taken a 13-week contract, and the nightly rate was reasonable, and the online reviews, while sparse, were mostly positive. The reviews that were positive were all more than 2 years old. She arrived on a Sunday evening in late October, checked in at the front desk with a man named Gordy, who was quiet and efficient, and gave her the key to room 7 on a plastic tag with the room number written in marker. She unpacked her scrubs by day of the week, set up her coffee maker on the dresser, and looked out the window at the parking lot. The light fixture on the pole at the far end of the lot was dark. Burned out, she assumed. She noted it the way you note a minor inconvenience and moved on. The town of Alderman's Gap had a gas station, a diner, a small grocery with inconsistent hours, a volunteer fire department, a Baptist church with a hand-lettered sign, and approximately 200 residents. It was the kind of town that had been the right size once and had stayed there while everything around it changed. Selah had worked rural contracts before. She knew how to exist in a place like this. Quietly, politely, without inserting herself into the social geometry of a community that hadn't asked for her. She ate at the diner on her first 2 evenings. The food was good in the straightforward way of places that have been making the same dishes for decades, and the waitress, a woman named Darla, was warm in the way of someone who found strangers interesting rather than suspicious. They talked about the hospital, about the drive up from Charlotte, about the weather coming in off the ridge. On the second evening, Selah asked about the trail she'd seen at the back of the motel parking lot, where the tree line came close to the asphalt. She was asking the way you ask about recreational options in a new place, practically, without agenda. Darla said, "I'd stay on the roadside of the parking lot." Selah asked why. Darla said, "The trail's washed out back there." Then she went to check on another table and did not return to the subject. The parking lot light was on when Selah woke up on the second night. She registered this slowly, the way you register a change in a room when you've been asleep. The light from outside was different, the window brighter than it should have been at whatever hour this was. She checked her phone. 3:17 in the morning. The light that had been dark since she'd arrived was on, and it was not aimed directly upward the way a parking lot light should be aimed. It was angled, tilted slightly, pointing not at the asphalt below it, but at the tree line at the far edge of the lot, at the specific gap in the trees where the washed-out trail began. She watched it for a few minutes. It went off at 3:29. 12 minutes exactly. She told herself the bulb had been intermittent rather than burned out, and that some timer function in the fixture had activated it, and that the angle was probably normal for that type of fixture, and she was noticing it because she was looking at it in the middle of the night. She went back to sleep. The third night, 3:17, 12 minutes, the same angle. The fourth night, she photographed her phone screen with the light visible in the window behind it. 3:17. The timestamp was in the image. The light was in the image. 12 minutes later, it went off, and she sat in the dark and looked at the photograph and thought about what kind of malfunction produces the same result at the same minute on 3 consecutive nights. She measured the light's angle the next afternoon, standing in the parking lot in daylight, sighting along the fixture's aim. It pointed at a specific gap in the tree line, a 3-foot-wide opening in the brush where the trail entered the woods. She walked to the gap and looked in. 20 feet of overgrown but passable trail before the vegetation closed in. The ground at the gap entrance was pressed flat in 2 parallel lines, narrow, feet together, facing the motel. She photographed these 2 and went back to her room. On the morning of the 4th day, she asked Gordy about the light. He said it had been broken for 6 months. She said it came on last night at 3:17. Gordy looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized from her medical work, the expression of someone deciding how much to say. Then he said, "It's been broken for 6 months." He went back to his office and closed the door. That evening, Selah noticed for the first time that the light in room 11 was on. Room 11 was at the end of the block, its window facing the tree line directly. She had assumed it was occupied. She'd seen the curtain move once, or thought she had, and she'd heard someone walking the parking lot late on what she now calculated had been the night the light first activated. She had not seen the guest directly. She had not thought much about it. She set her alarm for 3:15 on the 5th night. She sat in the dark in the chair by the window and watched the parking lot. At 3:17, the light came on. Same angle, same aim at the gap in the tree line. She looked at the gap. For 9 minutes, it was empty. Brush, darkness, the pressed parallel lines in the ground that she knew were there, even if she couldn't see them from this distance. Then, something was in the gap. Standing. Still. She could not see detail at this distance in this light. The fixture illuminated the gap's entrance but not its interior, and whatever was standing there was far enough inside the tree line that she had only the suggestion of a shape. Present. Facing the motel. Not moving. She reached for her phone to photograph it. The light went off at the 12-minute mark and the gap was dark, and she had nothing. She turned on her flashlight app and pointed it at the parking lot. The beam reached the asphalt in the first 10 feet of the tree line. The gap was empty, but the grass at the entrance, she could see it from here in the flashlight's edge, was pressed down freshly. 2 parallel lines facing the motel. The grass still slightly flattened in the way grass is flattened when weight has just been removed from it. She was still holding the flashlight when she noticed that the man from room 11 was standing in the parking lot. 3:17 exactly. Facing the tree line. Not moving. Standing in the center of the lot with his arms at his sides and his back to her window, looking at the gap in the trees with the focused stillness of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. She watched him for the full 12 minutes. He did not move during that time. Not a shift of weight, not a turn of the head, not the small unconscious adjustments a person makes when standing in the cold. He stood in the parking lot with his arms at his sides and faced the tree line with the absolute stillness of something that had stopped rather than something that was resting. And when the light went off at the 12-minute mark, he turned and walked back to room 11 and closed the door. Selah sat in the dark for a long time after that. In the morning, she went to the front desk before Gordy had finished his coffee. She described the man from room 11, his height, his build, the dark jacket he'd been wearing in the parking lot. She asked how many guests were currently checked in. Gordy said, 2, you and the man in room 3. She said room 11 had a light on every evening. Gordy set his coffee cup down. She said she had seen someone from room 11 walking the parking lot. She described the jacket again. She described the time, 3:17, the same time as the light. Gordy said, room 11 is vacant, has been since February. She asked what had happened in February. He picked up his coffee cup and looked at it, and then set it back down. He said a long-stay guest had checked out unexpectedly. The guest had called from the road to say he was leaving and that Gordy could pack his things, that he wasn't coming back for them. Gordy had packed them. The guest had never come back. She asked what the guest had said when he called. Gordy said, he said the light woke him up. He said something was looking in at his window from the parking lot. He paused. Room 11 faces the tree line directly. She asked what Gordy thought had been looking in. He said he didn't know. She asked if other guests had reported similar things. He said the reviews had been better 2 years ago. That afternoon, she walked to the gap in the tree line. She had decided the previous night that she would investigate it in daylight, because she was a practical person, and because the gap in daylight was a gap in a tree line, and whatever pressed the grass at its entrance had done so in the dark and not in her presence, and she was capable of looking at an overgrown trail without being frightened of it. She went 20 feet in. The trail was overgrown but not impassable, the vegetation scraping her arms on both sides, the ground soft under her shoes from recent rain. 20 feet in, she stopped. The pressed grass impression she'd photographed at the entrance was here too, at this interior point, the same 2 parallel lines, feet together, facing the motel. Farther in than the entrance, meaning whatever made the impression at the entrance had also stood here, deeper inside the trail, at some point. She did not go farther. She went back to her room and looked at her contract paperwork and calculated what early termination would cost her. On her second-to-last day, she tried Gordy one more time. She found him at the desk in the late morning, and she told him, plainly, what she had observed across the 11 nights of her stay. The light at 3:17, the 12 minutes, the gap in the tree line, the man from room 11, the pressed grass. All of it in the order it had happened, the way she would have reported a series of patient symptoms. When she finished, Gordy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The light used to be on a timer. General security, nothing specific, the timer broke." She said, "But the light still comes on, every night at 3:17. He said, "I know." She waited. He said, "Don't look at what it's pointing at." He said it the way her grandmother had told her not to pick at things, not a warning so much as a practical instruction, the kind delivered by someone who had already learned the consequence. "Just don't look at it," she said. "I've already looked." He nodded, like that was what he'd expected her to say. Like most people who stayed long enough had already looked by the time they thought to ask. He went back to his office, and this time she didn't follow him. She called her agency that afternoon and requested an early transfer, housing situation. No further detail. The agency offered her 1 additional week before the transfer could be arranged. She accepted and spent that week in a motel in Murphy, 25 minutes from the hospital, and drove the extra distance without complaint. 3 weeks after she left Alderman's Gap, she found herself thinking about the motel registration ledger she'd seen on Gordy's desk, the paper register for cash-paying guests, the kind of record kept in addition to the digital system. She had seen it once when Gordy had it open on the desk, and she had noticed the February page because Gordy had mentioned February, and she had looked at the page instinctively, the way you look at the thing someone has just named. The long-stay guest's row was there. Check-in date, room number, daily rate. The checkout column was blank. Gordy had listed the room as vacant. He had never recorded a checkout. She thought about the man from room 11 standing in the parking lot at 317, with his arms at his sides facing the tree line, still as something that had decided to stop. She thought about the February guest calling from the road to say he wasn't coming back. Calling from the road, not from the room. Already gone before Gordy could respond. She keeps the photograph of her phone screen, 317, the light visible in the window, on her current phone. She has not taken another rural contract in the 2 years since. She tells her agency she prefers urban placements now without explaining further. On her last night at the Alderman's Gap Motel, she set the alarm for 3:15 and sat in the chair by the window and made a decision. When the light came on at 3:17, she looked at the fixture, at the parking lot, at the asphalt. She did not look at the gap in the tree line. She sat with her hands in her lap and watched the light and counted the 12 minutes, and when the light went off, she went back to bed. She does not know what was in the gap that night. She kept her word to Gordy. She kept it deliberately, with the specific effort of a person who understands that some instructions are better followed late than never, even when the reason behind them hasn't been fully explained. She does not know if that helped. The light at Alderman's Gap still activates at 3:17 every morning, according to a review posted 8 months after her stay by a guest who described it as a minor nuisance and gave the motel 3 stars. The reviewer did not mention looking at what it pointed at. Sella read the review twice and did not comment on it. The last account in this collection is the one that took the longest to come out. It came from a retired park ranger who spent 31 years in the Nantahala and Pisgah National Forests. She submitted it in writing after she moved to another state. She said she had waited until she was out of the region to send it. She said that was not superstition. She said it was practicality. Her name is not here. The account is. For the purposes of this account, she is DW. She worked search and rescue for 22 of her 31 years. She'd found 3 bodies in the field over her career and filed the paperwork each time without losing a night's sleep. She was not a person who frightened easily or who reached for extraordinary explanations when ordinary ones were available. She said this herself in the written submission, in the first paragraph, and the way she said it suggested she understood how important it was that you believed it before you read the rest. The incident involved a missing hiker, a closed fire road in Graham County, a search grid she was assigned to alone, and a log entry that should not have existed. The GPS data she reviewed afterward showed she had walked the same quarter-mile section of the fire road 11 times during her first day on the grid. She had no memory of doing it more than once. The GPS unit was tested after the search concluded. It was found to be in perfect working order. She has never found an explanation for the 11 passes that satisfies her. She has tried. The hiker's name was not released publicly because the family requested privacy, which DW respected in her written account. She described him as a male in his mid-40s, experienced enough to have filed a proper permit with emergency contact information and a detailed gear list, inexperienced enough to have gone alone on a route that the district office had flagged for post-storm debris. He was reported overdue by his wife on the second morning after his planned return date. The search was initiated at noon that day. DW was assigned the Fire Road section because she knew the district and because the Fire Road, a closed service road off the main trail system in the Graham County portion of the Nantahala, showed signs of recent foot traffic that matched the hiker's profile. The road had been closed to public access for 2 years following a bridge washout at its far end. The gate was supposed to be locked. When DW arrived at the gate on the afternoon of the first day, the lock was open. Not forced, no cut chain, no damaged hasp, no pried receiver. The padlock was hanging open from one link of the chain as though someone had used a key and simply not relocked it behind them. She photographed it, noted it in her log, and proceeded through. She was methodical the way she had been methodical for 22 years of search work. She flagged every print she found, every disturbance in the vegetation, every place where the road surface showed recent compression. The hiker's boot size was on file from his permit paperwork, a size 11 with a specific lug pattern. And she found prints matching that description from the gate forward, consistent and clear in the soft road surface, walking at a normal pace, not running, not dragging. She found them for exactly 1.4 miles. At the 1.4 mile mark, the print stopped. Mid-stride, weight forward, the front edge of the boot print pressed deeper than the heel the way it is when a person is in motion. The next step did not exist. She circled the area in an expanding grid, the standard pattern, moving outward in careful loops, and she found nothing. No continuation in the leaf litter on either side of the road. No indication of a fall. No disturbance in the vegetation at the road's edge that would suggest he'd stepped off into the woods. The prince walked to that point, and the record of his movement ended there as though the road had simply stopped accepting evidence of him. She was still working the grid around the 1.4 mile mark when she remembered the trail register. The main trail junction near the Fire Road's entrance had a standard wooden register box, the kind with a hinged lid and a spiral notebook inside. DW had checked it on her way in and found the hiker's entry, which she'd photographed and noted. His handwriting was clear and his entry was standard: date, destination, expected return, except for 2 things. The date he'd written was 4 days before his registered start date, which could have been a simple error, and the final line of his entry, below the standard information, read, "Don't follow the marks past the fork." There were no marks visible at the fork where the Fire Road met the main trail. DW had looked specifically, because that line had stayed with her the way anomalous details stay with experienced searchers. Nothing on the trees, nothing on the gate, nothing on the road surface. She had cataloged the line as a possible note to a hiking partner, a reference to a different trail system, a misplaced personal reminder. She had moved on. Standing at the 1.4 mile mark with the absent prints in front of her, she thought about it again. She ran her 4:30 radio check. The station confirmed a receipt of her position and status. She told them about the print termination point, the expanded grid, the negative result. The station logged it. She began walking back toward the gate with 2 hours of good light remaining. At 4:47, she heard the whistle. It came from upslope of the Fire Road, above and to the east, from the wooded slope that rose steeply from the road's right edge. 3 short blasts, too long. She stopped walking immediately because she recognized the pattern. She had reviewed the hiker's permit paperwork that morning, and his registered emergency signal was 3 short and 2 long. A pattern his wife had confirmed he always used because he had used it with his son on hiking trips since the boy was small. She keyed her radio. "Station, I'm hearing the emergency signal from my position. Grid square confirmed. Upslope. East side of the fire road. The station said, "Copy, DW. No other teams are assigned to your grid. Confirm signal pattern." She confirmed the pattern, 3 short, 2 long. The station was quiet for a moment. Then, DW. The hiker's whistle was recovered from his vehicle at the trailhead on day 1. "It's been logged into evidence. Can you confirm you have the evidence manifest in front of you?" She said she did not have it in front of her, but that she had reviewed it that morning. The station said, "The whistle is in an evidence bag at the district office. It has been there since 1100 hours on day 1. DW stood on the fire road in the late afternoon light and looked at the slope above her. The trees were dense on the upslope side, the slope steep enough that she couldn't see more than 30 feet into the vegetation before the terrain folded away from her sight line. The whistle had stopped. The slope was quiet. She keyed the radio again. "Station, I'm hearing the registered emergency signal from an upslope position. I'm going to flag my current location and proceed toward the source. 15 minutes. I'll check in when I reach the area." The station said, "DW, confirm. You have reviewed the evidence manifest. You understand the whistle is not on the trail." She said, "Copy. I understand. Proceeding." She understood. She also understood that a distress signal was a distress signal regardless of what the evidence manifest said about the physical object registered to produce it. If the hiker was on that slope, if he was somehow signaling without his registered whistle, if there was any chance at all that the sound she had heard was a person in distress, and she walked back to the gate without investigating it, she would have to live with that. 22 years of search work had produced in her a specific and durable set of priorities, and the priority was always the same. You do not ignore a signal. She flagged her position and started upslope. The vegetation closed around her immediately, the steep terrain forcing her to use both hands on the ascent, flagging tape in one hand, radio in the other. She moved carefully and quickly, calling her position into the radio every few minutes, marking her route as she went. The slope was wet from the recent rain, and the leaf litter was soft and deep, good tracking conditions if there was anything to track. She found nothing on the ascent, no broken vegetation, no compression in the leaf litter, no sign that anyone had moved through this section of slope recently. She reached the approximate source area in 11 minutes. There was nothing there. There was also a fire. Not a large fire, not a campfire in the full sense, not the kind built for warmth or cooking. A small, careful arrangement of stones in a rough circle, the stones blackened from heat, the interior filled with ash and a few partially burned sticks. The fire had burned down to cold ash, but at the center, beneath the ash layer, the coals were still warm. She pressed the back of her hand near them without touching. Warm enough that the fire had been burning within the last several hours. Recent enough to matter. No tent, no pack, no gear of any kind. No boot prints in the immediate area. The soil around the fire ring was soft enough to hold prints easily, and it was undisturbed except for one partial impression at the ring's far edge. The toe of a boot, pressed into the soil at an angle that suggested the person making it had been crouching or leaning forward. The size was wrong for the missing hiker. Smaller. Different tread. She photographed the fire ring, the partial print, the surrounding area. She radioed the station with a full description and coordinates. The station logged it and confirmed they would send a secondary team to document the site the following morning. She stood at the fire ring and looked at the slope above her, which rose another 200 feet to the ridge. The light was going. She had a decision to make, and she made it. She would descend, complete her check-in, and return in the morning with the secondary team. The fire site was documented. The signal had not repeated. Proceeding further upslope and failing light on a wet, steep slope with no partner was not a choice her training permitted. She descended to the fire road and began walking back toward the gate. She checked her GPS at the fire road's edge to confirm her position before the walkout. The unit read 1.4 miles. She looked at the screen. She looked at the road around her. She looked at the flagging tape she'd placed at her upslope departure point, which was still tied to the branch where she'd left it, visible from where she was standing. She checked the paper map in her vest pocket and traced her route with her finger. She was standing at approximately the 2.1-mile mark on the fire road. Her GPS said she was at 1.4 miles. She shook the unit. She turned it off and on. When it restarted, it read 1.4 miles. She walked to the gate using the paper map and her own flagging tape as reference, ignoring the GPS readout. At the gate, she called the station with her end-of-day status and mentioned the GPS anomaly as a possible unit malfunction. The station recommended she swap it for the backup unit in her vehicle kit. She sat in her truck at the gate with the GPS in her hand and pulled up the track log before she reached for the backup unit. The track log showed her entry point, her walk up the fire road, her grid work at the 1.4-mile mark, her descent to the fire road from the upslope site. All of that was correct and expected. What was not expected was what appeared between the grid work and the upslope ascent. A series of position records showing her at the 1.4-mile mark, and then again, and then again, and then again. She scrolled through them. The unit had recorded her at the 1.4-mile mark multiple times during what she remembered as a continuous walk from the grid work toward the gate. She had reached the gate before she ran out of daylight. She needed to start the truck and drive out and eat something and sleep. She turned to the first entry in the anomalous sequence to see the timestamp and count the repetitions. She got 3 entries into the count before she had to radio in her end of day, and the station kept her on for 12 minutes with administrative questions about the fire site documentation. And by the time she signed off, the light was fully gone, and she needed both hands to drive the service road safely. She did not look at the rest of the track log that night. She has said, in the written account, that she is not certain she wanted to. She swapped the GPS unit for the backup before she went up on day 2. The original unit went into a labeled evidence bag in her truck, not standard protocol for a malfunctioning piece of personal equipment, but she wanted it preserved, and she followed the instinct. She had been in the field long enough to know the difference between an instinct worth following and one worth questioning, and this one felt like the former. Day 2 began with low cloud cover and the particular flatness of light that comes before rain, the kind of morning that makes distances look shorter than they are, and shadows disappear entirely. She was at the gate by 7. The lock was still as she'd left it. She drove the service road to the fire road's entrance, parked, and started up on foot with the backup GPS running and her paper map out. The track log on the backup unit was clean. She checked it at the gate and again at the half-mile mark. It was recording her position correctly, the line of her route building accurately on the screen as she moved up the fire road. She watched it for the first mile, the way you watch a patient monitor after a medication change, not anxiously, but with the specific attention of someone who needs to know whether the situation has stabilized. At the 1.4-mile mark, she stopped and stood for a moment. The flagging tape from the previous day was still in place. The expanded grid area she'd worked was unchanged. The point where the hiker's prints ended was exactly as she'd left it, the final impression still clear in the soft road surface, weight forward, mid-stride, going nowhere. She moved on toward the bridge site. At the 2.1-mile mark, she found the marks. They were cut into the bark of a series of trees on the uphill side of the road, eye height, spaced roughly 20 feet apart. Not trail blazes were painted or made with a single axe stroke, and followed a standard pattern that any ranger could read. These were different. A series of short horizontal cuts arranged in a configuration she did not recognize from any trail marking system, survey notation, or forest management standard she had encountered in 31 years. She stood in front of the first one for a long time and turned through her mental catalog of marks and symbols and found nothing that matched. She photographed each one in sequence, numbering them in her notes. There were 7 visible from the road. They continued beyond the last one she could see from her position, disappearing around the curve of the fire road toward the bridge site. She noted their existence, their location, their sequence, and the fact that they did not correspond to any known system. She moved forward. The bridge site was at 2.8 miles. The bridge itself had been gone for 2 years. A flash flood had taken the decking and most of the support structure, leaving only the concrete abutments on either bank of the creek, which ran fast and high between them, the gap between the abutments 15 feet across. The creek was higher than normal for the season, the water opaque with sediment from the recent rain, moving with the specific urgency of a waterway that has received more than it can process. On the far abutment, placed neatly at its center, was the hiker's blaze-orange stuff sack. She recognized it from the gear list in his permit paperwork. A small dry bag, blaze-orange, used for emergency supplies. It was listed on the permit. It had not been in the evidence recovered from his vehicle at the trailhead. She had noted its absence from the evidence manifest that morning. It was on the far abutment. 15 feet across moving water, on a concrete surface 5 feet above the creek level, in a place that required crossing the gap to reach. She documented it from the near bank with her camera, the longest zoom she had. She radioed the station with the location and description. The station confirmed the item was on the missing gear list and said they would arrange a water crossing team for the following day. She looked at the far bank. The marks on the trees, the same configuration she'd been following up the road, began again on the far side, visible from the near bank, continuing into the woods beyond the abutment. She stood at the creek edge and looked at both sides of the gap for a while. Then she turned and began the walk back toward the gate. The forest went quiet at the 2.1-mile mark. She noticed it the way she had learned to notice it in the hollow account. Not as an observation, but as a physical event, a pressure change. One moment, the ordinary sounds of a wet forest in November. Water dripping from branches, birds in the upper canopy, wind across the ridge above. Then nothing. All of it, simultaneously, gone. She had encountered total forest silence before in her career, and it meant large predator in the immediate area, consistently, every time she had experienced it. She stopped walking and stood still and listened with the specific quality of attention that 22 years of field work produces. Not frightened, but completely present. Every sense oriented outward. No predator sound followed. No branch crack, no movement in the brush, no exhalation. The silence was complete and sourceless. She held her position for 4 minutes by her watch. The forest remained silent. She counted the seconds of the 5th minute. At 4 minutes and 22 seconds, the voice came from the far bank. From above the bridge abutment, in the trees on the far side of the creek, something said what sounded like her name. Not her call sign, not ranger, not hello. Her name. First and last, clearly enunciated, at a volume and distance consistent with a person standing in the trees 30 or 40 feet from the creek edge. She keyed her radio before the sound had finished. Station, I'm at the bridge site. I'm hearing a voice from the far bank. Can you confirm any team members on the east side of the Fire Road Creek crossing? The station said there were no team members on the east side. The search had been concentrating resources in the western grid sections that day. No one should have been on the far bank. She stood at the creek edge and looked at the trees on the far side, and the trees looked back at her with the flat silence of trees. The voice did not repeat. She looked down at her GPS. The backup unit read 1.4 miles. She looked at it for a long moment. She tapped the screen. The reading held. She pulled out her paper map and put her finger on her position. Bridge site. 2.8 miles. She was standing at the bridge site, and the GPS said she was at the 1.4 mile mark, the same reading the original unit had given her when she'd been standing at the 2.1 mile mark the previous afternoon. She turned the unit off and on. It restarted and read 1.4 miles. She put the paper map away and radioed the station. "Station, I have a second GPS unit showing incorrect position. Putting both units out of service, navigating by map only." The station acknowledged. She stood at the bridge site with the useless GPS in her hand and thought about two separate units, checked out from different equipment stores, showing the same incorrect reading at the same section of the same road on 2 consecutive days. She thought about the track log on the original unit, the anomalous repetitions she hadn't finished counting. She thought about standing at the 1.4 mile mark on day 1, working the expanded grid, the last confirmed point where the hiker's prints existed. She pulled up the track log on the backup unit to see what it had recorded. The log showed her entry point, her walk up the fire road, the stop at the 1.4 mile mark, the walk to the 2.1 mile mark, the documentation of the marks, the walk to the bridge site. And then, between the 1.4 mile mark and the 2.1 mile mark, a series of position records she had not produced. The backup unit had recorded her at the 1.4 mile mark. Then again. Not as many repetitions as the original unit. She scrolled through them, counting, but 6 additional passes through the same quarter-mile section that she had walked once and remembered walking once. She had no memory of returning to the 1.4 mile mark 6 times. She had a clear, continuous memory of walking from the grid work at 1.4 miles forward to the marks at 2.1 miles without stopping or turning back. Her flagging tape was in place at each documented position. Her boots were wet from the continuous forward walk. She had not turned around. She stood at the bridge site with the GPS in her hand, and the creek moving behind her, and the trees on the far side holding their silence. And she tried to construct an explanation for 6 unremembered passes through a section of road she had no recollection of revisiting. She could not build one that held. She flagged her position and walked out to the gate using the paper map, not looking at the GPS readout. She ate in her truck. She reviewed her notes. She documented everything she had observed in the field log with the precision and completeness of someone who understood that her documentation might eventually be read by people who had not been there and who would need the details to be specific. Then she wrote, at the bottom of the day's entry, in smaller letters than her usual field notation, both units, same position, same reading. Check track log from Unit 1 when back at station. She did not sleep well that night, but she did sleep because she had been doing this work for 22 years, and she understood that a searcher who didn't sleep was a searcher who made mistakes in the field, and whatever was happening on the fire road, the hiker was still missing, and she was going back in the morning. She went back in the morning. She was at the gate before sunrise on day 3. The weather had changed overnight. The low cloud cover had lifted, and the morning was cold and clear. The kind of Appalachian fall morning where the light comes in at a low angle and makes everything look precise and close. Every branch and stone edge sharp against the sky. It felt like the kind of morning where things would be findable. She had learned over 22 years not to trust that feeling, but she felt it anyway. She had reviewed the track log from the original GPS unit the previous evening at the district office, after the administrative questions had finished and the station had gone to its overnight skeleton crew. She had sat at the desk with the unit plugged into the computer and the log open on the screen, and she had counted the repetitions carefully, the way she counted everything, methodically, without rushing, starting from the beginning. 11 passes. The original unit had recorded her walking the quarter-mile section between the 1.3 and 1.5 mile marks of the fire road 11 times on day 1. Her flagging tape confirmed 1 pass. Her memory confirmed 1 pass. Her boots had been wet from a continuous forward walk. The unit had recorded 11. She had sat with that number for a while before she drove back to her rental room. On day 3, she used only the paper map. Both GPS units were in evidence bags in her truck. She had noted the equipment anomaly in her formal report as a possible unit malfunction, attached both track logs as supplemental files, and recommended a full equipment diagnostic. She had not noted the 11 repetitions specifically in the main report. She had put that detail in the supplemental file, labeled, dated, and signed in case it became relevant. She walked up the fire road with her flagging tape and her radio and her paper map, and the specific focused attention of someone on the last authorized day of a search section. The station had told her the previous evening that the search was shifting. A secondary team had found what appeared to be a secondary campsite in the western grid, 2 miles from the fire road, and the resources were being redirected. DW had 1 day to complete her section and document before returning. She moved efficiently. She was at the 1.4 mile mark by 7:45. The notebook was on the road's edge. She saw it from 20 feet away and stopped. A small spiral notebook, the kind sold at gas stations and dollar stores, red cover, placed neatly on the gravel at the road's right edge. Not dropped, the placement was deliberate. The notebook set parallel to the road's edge with its cover facing up, undamaged by the overnight damp in a way that suggested it had been placed there recently. She photographed it from her approach position, then moved to it and crouched beside it without touching it. It was open. The pages were folded flat against the gravel, open to a page near the middle. The writing was in blue ink, small and neat, covering about half the page. She read it without touching the notebook. The marks show where it watches from. Do not follow them back. She read it twice. Then she looked up at the trees on the uphill side of the road. The marks were visible from the road at this point. She had not noticed this on the previous 2 days because she hadn't been looking for them from this exact position. But crouching at road level, she could see the first 2 marks clearly through the vegetation, the same configuration she had documented at the 2.1 mile mark, cut into the bark at eye height. The sequence began here, at the 1.4 mile mark, at the point where the hiker's prints had ended. The marks led up slope, toward the fire site. She stood up and radioed the station. She gave her position, described the notebook, read the contents aloud for the recording. The station logged it and told her a team would reach her position in approximately 25 minutes. She confirmed and began photographing the notebook from multiple angles. She was on her 4th photograph when she heard the footsteps. They were on the fire road behind her, coming from the bridge site direction, from the east. She turned. The road curved 40 feet behind her, the bend obscuring the view beyond it, and the footsteps were coming from around that bend, on the gravel surface, weighted, deliberate, the specific sound of boot leather on loose stone that she had been hearing for 22 years, and could not mistake for anything else. She watched the curve. The footsteps did not slow as they approached the bend. They came around it at the same pace, the same weighted, deliberate rhythm, and she tracked the sound with her eyes as it moved from the curve to the straight section toward her. And there was nothing there. The gravel was undisturbed. No compression, no scuff, no dust rising. The footsteps continued at a walking pace through empty air on an empty road. The sound arriving at her position and passing it, and continuing west toward the gate. Each footfall distinct and separate and sourceless, moving through the space in front of her while she stood still and watched the gravel show her nothing. She did not move until the sound had passed her by the 30 feet. Then she looked at the road surface where the sound had moved through. She crouched and looked at the gravel closely, undisturbed. She stood and looked at the road in the direction the sound was moving. The gate was a quarter-mile west. The sound was still going, fading with distance the way a person's footsteps fade when they walk away, and then it was gone. She was still looking at the gate when the whistle came. 3 short, 2 long, from upslope, from the fire site. Close. Closer than the first time she had heard it on day 1. Closer than any point she had reached on the slope during her day 1 ascent. Clear and deliberate, the registered pattern, the one the hiker had used with his son since the boy was small. She looked at the notebook on the road at her feet. The marks show where it watches from. Do not follow them back. She looked at the marks on the trees, the sequence beginning at the 1.4-mile mark and leading upslope to the fire site. While she looked at her watch. 23 minutes until the team reached her position. She keyed the radio. Station, I'm hearing the emergency signal again at my position. Same pattern. Source is upslope, consistent with the fire site location from day 1. The station said, "Copy. DW team is en route. Hold your position." She looked at the slope. The morning light came through the canopy at its low angle and made the marks on the trees sharp and clear against the bark. 7 marks she had documented, and more beyond the curve toward the bridge site, and the sequence beginning here at the 1.4-mile mark, the same point where the prints ended, the same point both GPS units had returned to in their anomalous readings, 11 passes and then 6, the units finding that number and holding it across 2 separate instruments on 2 separate days. She was a searcher. She had been a searcher for 22 years. There was a distress signal coming from the slope above her, and a missing person unaccounted for, and the protocol was clear and had been clear for as long as she had been doing this work. She flagged her position at the notebook. She marked the starting point of the upslope route with a double flag, the standard signal for an active approach. She looked at the team's ETA on her radio display. 21 minutes. She started upslope. She told herself she would go as far as the fire site, confirm or deny an active signal source, and return to the road before the team arrived. She had done this calculation before in the field, the math of how far a single searcher should push before waiting for support, and she had been conservative with it for 22 years. She was being less conservative now. She knew that. She went anyway. The slope was steep and wet, and she moved carefully, using the flagging tape from day 1 as her route guide where it was still in place, adding new flags where she had missed sections. The marks on the trees below her were visible as she climbed, the sequence clear from above. She could see the pattern now in a way she hadn't been able to from the road, the configuration of each mark relating to the next in what seemed, from this angle, like a directed sequence, each mark pointing upslope toward the next. She reached the fire site in 9 minutes. The fire ring was there, the stones in their careful circle, the ash at the center, and the coals were warm again. She pressed the back of her hand toward the center without touching and felt the heat, the same as day 1, recent enough to have been burning within the last several hours. The hiker was sitting beside the fire ring with his back to her, facing upslope toward the ridge. She said his name. He turned around. His expression was calm. That was the first thing she registered. Not fear, not relief, not the particular desperate gratitude of a person found after days lost in the woods. calm. The specific calm of someone who believed they were exactly where they were supposed to be, and had no particular reason to think otherwise. She asked him if he was injured. He said no. She asked him to stand so she could assess him visually. He stood without difficulty. No visible injuries, no obvious dehydration signs, no tremor, no hypothermia presentation. His color was good, his movements were normal, his eyes were tracking correctly. She ran through the standard field assessment with the efficiency of someone who had done it hundreds of times, and he passed every check. She asked him what day he thought it was. He told her the date of the day he had started his hike. She said that was 4 days ago. He looked at her without the expression changing. He said that wasn't possible. He said he'd been out here since this morning. He said he'd made camp, had a fire, had slept once, and it had been one night. He said this with the certainty of a person reporting a fact rather than arguing a point. She did not debate it with him. She had been in the field long enough to know that disorientation in lost persons could produce absolute conviction in wrong information, and that arguing with the conviction in the field helped nobody. She told him the team was coming, that they were going to get him down, that everything was going to be fine. She asked him where his gear was. He looked around as though he expected to see it. It was not there. No pack, no water, no food, no sleeping bag, no tent. His jacket was the one listed on his permit. His boots were the ones that matched the prints. His emergency stuff sack, the blaze orange dry bag she had photographed on the far abutment of the washed-out bridge, was in his jacket pocket. She saw it when he reached in for something, and it was there, in his pocket, on the near side of an uncrossable creek. She did not ask him about it yet. She radioed the station with his status: found, ambulatory, apparently uninjured, disoriented regarding time, and gave her coordinates. The station relayed to the team. She stayed at the fire site with him and asked him careful, practical questions about how he had felt, what he had eaten, what he remembered. He remembered starting his hike. He remembered the trailhead. He remembered reaching the fire road and finding it open. He remembered making the fire. He did not remember the intervening days in any form. There was no gap in his experience. From his perspective, one day had passed. The missing days did not exist in his account of himself. She asked him about the notebook. He said he didn't have a notebook. She described it: red cover, spiral bound, his pen, his jacket pocket where she'd seen the orange stuff sack. He checked his jacket. No notebook. He checked his pants pockets. No notebook. He said he didn't own a notebook like that. He said the pen in his pocket was his, the same one listed on his permit, but he had not used it to write anything on the trail. She looked at the pen in his hand. Blue, medium point. The same type as the pen that had written the entry in the logbook. The same type as the pen in the notebook on the road. Whether it was the same pen she couldn't confirm in the field. She did not ask him about the marks on the trees. She did not ask him about the sounds she had heard on the road below, the footsteps through empty air, the whistle from this location on day one when he could not have been here, and his whistle had been in an evidence bag at the district office. She asked him only what she needed to ask, and then she got him moving downslope. He made the descent without difficulty. His physical condition was genuinely inconsistent with 4 days of exposure without food or water or shelter. He showed none of the markers she would have expected from that duration. His lips were dry, but not cracked. His cognition was clear. His core temperature when the paramedics assessed him at the gate was normal. The medical team's field notes used the phrase consistent with short-term outdoor exposure and listed duration as unknown. He went to the hospital for observation and was released the following morning. He did not recover the missing days. The neurological workup found nothing. His wife sat with him through 2 rounds of evaluation and told the attending physician that her husband had no history of dissociative episodes and that she did not understand what had happened. The attending physician, in his notes, listed the diagnosis as a stress-induced dissociative episode with time distortion, and noted that the duration of the episode was inconsistent with observed physical status. DW completed her section documentation and submitted her formal report that afternoon. She included the fire site, the notebook, the blaze orange stuff sack recovered from the hiker's jacket pocket, and the marks on the trees. She listed the GPS anomaly in the supplemental file with both track logs attached. She did not include the footsteps in her formal report. She included them in a separate personal addendum that she marked as observation notes and attached without routing it through the standard review chain. She was not certain the footsteps were documentable. She was certain she had heard them. The marks were cataloged the following week by a secondary team. Their report noted that the configuration did not correspond to any known trail marking system, survey notation, land management standard, or historical logging notation used in the region. The report recommended the marks be photographed and archived. No further action was listed. The marks were photographed and the report was filed. 3 weeks later, DW drove back to the fire road on her own time. She parked outside the gate and looked at the first section of the road from that distance. She had told herself she was checking whether the area looked different in the daylight of a different week, whether the perspective from outside the active search was clarifying. She was also checking the marks. The first 3 trees in the sequence were visible from the gate. She had documented them. She knew exactly where they were and what they looked like. The bark was clean. She stood at the gate and looked at the 3 trees for a long time. The marks were gone. Not weathered, not faded, gone. The bark surface smooth and unbroken. No indication that anything had been cut into it. Bark does not heal blaze marks in 3 weeks. She had been cutting blazes into trees for 31 years, and she knew exactly how long it took bark to begin recovering from a cut, and 3 weeks was not it. She photographed the 3 trees. Clean bark. She photographed her original documentation of the marks on those same trees from the search week. Cut marks, clearly visible. She put the camera away. The flagging tape she had placed on the road on day 3 was also gone. She could see from the gate where the first flag should have been. The branch was bare. She drove away and did not go back. 4 months later, she filed for retirement. 31 years of service, fully eligible, the paperwork straightforward. Her stated reason was years of service. Her supervisor accepted it without question because she had 31 years and was eligible, and that was sufficient. She did not give another reason because there was not a category on the retirement form for what had actually happened, and she was not certain she could have described it in those terms even if there had been. She moved out of state within 8 months of her retirement date. She submitted this written account 18 months after the move. At the bottom of the final page, in smaller writing than the rest of the account, she had added one sentence that she did not introduce or explain. It appeared below the last paragraph of the main account, separated by a few lines of white space, as though she had finished writing and then come back to it. The equipment diagnostic on both GPS units had found no malfunction. No fault, no irregularity, no explanation for 11 passes through the same quarter-mile section on the original unit, or 6 passes on the backup. Both units were certified as functioning within normal parameters. The diagnostic team's report noted that the track log data was anomalous, but that no equipment failure had been identified that could account for the anomaly. The report recommended the units be returned to service. They were returned to service. The notebook was retained as evidence. The handwriting analysis came back 6 weeks after the search concluded. The writing did not match the hiker. It did not match DW. It did not match any team member who had been assigned to the search. The analysis noted that the ink composition was consistent with a blue medium point pen of the same brand as the one recovered from the hiker, but that the pressure patterns in the writing indicated a left-handed writer. The hiker was right-handed. Every team member assigned to the search was right-handed. The analysis listed the authorship as unknown. The stuffed sack was examined by the evidence team for any indication of how it had reached the far abutment of the washed-out bridge. The abutment was 5 feet above the creek level. The gap between the abutments was 15 feet across fast-moving water. The stuffed sack showed no signs of having been thrown or dropped. It had been placed, set flat, centered on the abutment. The evidence team's notes listed the placement method as undetermined. The hiker returned to hiking the following spring. He does not hike alone now. He has not returned to the Graham County trail system. He does not remember the fire road. DW does not hike. She has not been in a national forest since her retirement. She lives in a state without mountains. The sentence at the bottom of the last page of her written account, the one she added after she had finished writing, separated by white space from everything that came before it, read as follows. The thing I keep coming back to is not the GPS, it's the notebook. Specifically, the last 2 words. The page read, "The marks show where it watches from. Do not follow them back." And then, below that, in the same handwriting, smaller, as though added afterward, "Too late." She offered no interpretation of those 2 words. She did not explain whether they referred to her, to the hiker, to the search, to something she had seen at the fire site on day 3 that she had not included in any version of the account. She ended the submission there with the quotation and signed her initials below it. The account arrived from an out-of-state postmark. The return address was a P.O. box that was closed by the time anyone thought to check it. The fire road gate has been relocked. The district office lists the road as closed indefinitely pending bridge repair. The repair has not been scheduled.